When we hear this text from Matthew's Gospel, the image that is given to us is a cup of water given to a little one. But instead of talking about that today, I want to talk about capture the flag. Some of you would be familiar with this game. It's something that our young people have played, some of them at camp. Capture the flag is a game where you take two teams and you separate them and give them each what I'm going to call a territory. And those two territories are meant to be equivalent, and then you give each of them a flag, and they put their flag in their territory. And the object of the game is to get the other team's flag from wherever you find it in their territory into your territory. And so you have to protect your territory and take something from the other team. Now, what does capture the flag have to do with welcome? We'll get there. This gospel text says, welcome, whoever welcomes me, Jesus says, welcomes you, welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me, welcomes the one who sent me. And he talks about welcoming a righteous person and a prophet and giving a cup of water to a little one. In our present time, especially in a community like Orlando, where our economy is really driven by hospitality, when we hear these words, welcome, 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 it probably sounds a lot to us like the hospitality that many of us were trained to give, whether that's at an amusement park, in the church, or in some way, shape, or form in our service and hospitality industry. But I don't think this text is exactly about that kind of hospitality. I actually think it is about speaking and about hearing. And to see how it's about speaking and hearing, you have to actually back up to the beginning of chapter 10. We just heard the last 3 verses of chapter 10. But at the beginning of chapter 10, Jesus is telling the disciples, I am sending you out. And they are sent out to go to people for whom the systems of the world are not working. They're going to go and they're going to heal people that are sick. They're going to cast out demons. And Jesus tells them they're going to proclaim the good news. Now, the good news that Jesus speaks of is that God's kingdom is near. The kingdom of heaven is near. And when the kingdom of heaven is near, that means that the systems of the world that leave people behind and don't work for everybody are going to be upended. And so when Jesus tells them that they're going to go do this, he also tells them not everyone is going to want to hear what you have to say. Not everyone is going to welcome you. He then goes on to tell them that their testimony, their bringing of this good news may get them into trouble. It may get them hauled before authorities and beaten. They may be hated. They may even have to die. But Jesus says if you're in the midst of those sorts of places, don't worry about what words you're going to speak. God will give you the words that you will speak. And so they have been told they're going to proclaim, and then they are also told that when it goes badly, they will be given more words to say. Jesus continues in the chapter to tell them, right, they're going to be like sheep amidst wolves. There's going to be division. Families are going to be turned on one another. And he tells them, what you have heard me say in the dark, you will speak into the light. What I have whispered to you, you will proclaim. Again, more speaking. And so all the way through this 10th chapter, what Jesus is telling them is you're going to speak God's grace into the world. You're going to talk about how God's reign, God's kingdom is going to come and turn over the systems that aren't working for everybody. And nobody's going to want to hear that. It's going to be a tough message. It's going to create division, and it's going to be dangerous for you. After all of that, then Jesus gets to them and says, whoever welcomes you all, welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. But again, it's important to pay attention to the ways that he says this. First, he says, whoever welcomes you. You being the disciples that he is sending out to speak this word that the kingdom of heaven is near. Then he says, whoever welcomes a prophet. Now, the prophets had a couple of roles. One was to speak comfort when times were bad, but the other was to speak a critical word when the community wasn't living up to the vision that God had for them. And so, as he tells the disciples, you're going to go speak what might be a tough word for somebody. It's just like when prophets speak a tough word. The next one is whoever welcomes a righteous person. Righteous people being those whose lives are completely in line with God's gift of grace. Now most of us, none of us really get there, right? It's God's grace that lives in us. But that righteous person is an example of God's vision for the world. And when we're not living up to it, right, that can be a challenging word. The last one then is the little one that the cup of water goes to. Little kids have a great way of asking really sharp questions because they haven't become cynical yet, and they haven't necessarily learned what many adults do, is to find gray areas and loopholes. And so kids have a way of speaking a word that can challenge us to see where our behavior isn't in line with what it ought to be, because they don't have all of the baggage that we have. They can ask those questions. So just in these few verses, Jesus talks about the disciples, prophets, righteous people, and little ones who can speak tough truths even though they don't always know they're doing that. And all of that comes in this space of welcome after he has said, you're going out and you're going to speak a word about the systems of this world that don't work for everyone. So that when he says whoever welcomes you, what Jesus is really saying is whoever welcomes the difficult word that you are speaking to them, whoever welcomes this critical word that you are speaking to them, whoever welcomes this word that might be hard to hear, they're welcoming me. Now that's a hard space for us to live, and this is where I think this text switches from speaking to hearing. How is it that we hear a tough word? I was in a project once when I was an IT person that involved a whole bunch of the people in a consumer packaged goods company that made all the decisions. They were the people that ran the materials that came into the factory, and they were the ones that were in charge of the stuff that got produced, and they were the ones who were in charge of packaging and making sure that the product was distributed in the way that it ought. Now they collectively each had their piece of that process, but the whole process had some problems. And they could talk about that individually, but if you put them in a room, it became a great big game of capture the flag. All of them started to defend their own little territory, and not just defending it, but trying to take things from other places, because their territory was incented by their Christmas bonus and their raise, which allowed them to live the lifestyle that they did. And any threat, any tough word that the system wasn't working in some way was a threat to them. And so they protected that territory all the while trying to take more from others. And I would bet that most of you, if you have been in the working world, if you have been in an educational environment, if you live in an HOA, if you are part of a family, have participated in some level of game of capture the flag, where a tough word gets spoken, and the first thing we do is say, nope, I am not going to listen to that tough word. I'm going to defend the territory that is mine, and I might even try to take something from you to keep me safe. That is what happens to Jesus. When he comes into the world and he walks around and he starts to spend time with the wrong kind of people and say things that people didn't want to hear, they said, no, you shouldn't be hanging out with the prostitutes and the tax collectors and the sinners, and no, you shouldn't be doing that thing, and no, you shouldn't be saying those things about God, because that's not the way it works. And it's when we get to those spaces of God that our territorial nature becomes the harshest, because we don't like people to challenge our notions of God, because our notions of God are deeply tied to our notions of ourself. And if I'm challenging your notion of God and your notion of yourself, then of course you're going to get to that place of being defensive and wanting to defend that territory and maybe even take my flag and take it someplace else. We are living in a time where these sorts of tough words come to us fairly regularly, and we have opportunities to respond to them. I'm mindful that in our culture we have had over, not just recently, but over many months now, what has been the Me Too moment, where women have stepped forward and said, yes, I too was assaulted, or I too experienced this sort of harassment or discriminatory behavior. And as a white male, it's easy for me to just want to say, nope, I'm going to defend my territory and say, that's not me, I'm not a sexist, and I don't live in that sort of way. But if I pause for a minute, and listen, and hear, and reflect, and maybe even confess, I might get to a different space. It's then that I remember the first project I was on when I got out of college, where there were about equal number of men and women in our office. But our boss would come in, and there was just a little bit of filing that needed to be done, and he always gave that work to a woman who happened to be the most talented person on our team. And then when I look back at that now, I go, gosh, that was inappropriate behavior, and it was sexist behavior, and I actually knew that then. But did I say anything then? Nope, I sure did not. And so when I hear Me Too, what I can do is think about the ways that I have participated in systems that worked for me, that didn't work the same for her, or I can defend my territory. Similarly, we've got a lot of systematic racism in our world. And for many of us, when we hear that, the first place you want to go is to say, I'm not a racist. And this isn't about you being an individual racist as how it is that we participate in systems that disadvantage one race over another. And again, I can defend my territory, or I can be more reflective. I can remember the time that I was at a car dealer, and there was a vehicle that I wanted. And it was a used vehicle. It was the only one like that they had. And while I was talking to the salesperson, he looked around, and he looked at me and said, I don't like selling vehicles to black people. He didn't say it exactly like that. He was much more rude and crude about it. Now, at the time, I could have looked at him and said, that's inappropriate. You're participating in a system and being a racist in a way that I'm uncomfortable with. Is that what I did? Nope. I wanted that car, right? And so I just let that go and participated in a system that continues to bring racism into the world. I could have defended my territory, right? And right now, when those sorts of questions are raised in our culture, but what Jesus is saying in this text is that we ought to listen when those uncomfortable words come, because they may just be from God. It may be a word that comes from the Lord that says the systems in this world don't work for everyone, and you might be a part of that system not working. Now, this is where we can start to want to get into that territorial space again. And here's the thing. Jesus says, whoever welcomes you, the one that is bringing the tough word of the Lord that says our systems aren't working for everybody, welcomes me. What that means is that Jesus meets us where we meet that tough word. It means that Jesus finds us in those places where we may have to be wrestling with our role in the world, and we may be trying to protect our territory and even taking something from someone else. And Jesus is saying, nope, that's where I meet you. And if you think about Jesus' life in all of those places where he was bringing a tough word that said your behavior is out of line with God's vision of life for the world, people protected their territory, but they ultimately took something. They took his life from him on the cross. And that cross sits right in the middle of our giant capture the flag game. Anytime we start to think, oh gosh, this is a territory that I need to defend, and I don't participate in that, and that's not me that these things are about. Jesus is landing that cross right there and saying, this uncomfortable word may not be easy to hear, and it may not be easy to cope with, but it is a gift of life. Because even though they took Jesus' life from him, he gives us life back. His response to the territorial protection and the taking of his life is to give us new life in return. Not to defend his territory, not to fight back, but to open up a new possibility. He takes away the game of capture the flag altogether and leaves us in a new space where life and grace and forgiveness are part of what we do. Now, we as people are really good at continuing to play capture the flag. And I think part of what makes all of our systems now so muddied and hard to live with is that we don't know what we're defending. Jesus has taken away the territory to defend, so we define it ourselves and we defend it the best we can. And if we have to take something from somebody else to make ourselves feel better, we do that too. And Jesus in all of that comes in and says, no, that's where I meet you. I meet you on the cross in that space where you're defending yourself against others and where you are trying to make your own space. The whole of this 10th chapter of Matthew is filled with God's work, though. It is God's kingdom that has come near. It is God's words that the disciples are sent to speak. When Jesus speaks about prophets, it is God's words that the prophets speak. When Jesus speaks about a righteous person, it is God's righteousness that lives in that person. All of this means that as Jesus comes to us, he too brings us that gift of life. He brings us his righteousness and his forgiveness and his grace, so that even when we do find ourselves playing capture the flag, Jesus meets us in that place and frees us from that game and sends us out to live in a different way. A way that allows us to hear a tough word and to be reflective on it. A way that allows us to speak words of grace and words of the kingdom. A way that frees us from the brokenness that around us and helps us to go out into the world in a different way. Which brings us back to how this story really is about speaking and hearing. It is about hearing a tough word and trusting that Jesus meets in that tough word, but then it's also about how we speak. Because those same disciples that were sent, right, we are sent in the same way. Martin Luther in the Eighth Commandment talks about when we're not just to not bear false witness, but we are to speak about our neighbor in the best possible light, even if we know they are guilty. When Martin Luther talks about hallowing God's name and talks about honoring God in the commandments and in the Lord's Prayer and in the Creed, what he talks about is that the ways we speak are important and the words that we choose are important. And so as we go into the world now, hearing a tough word, sometimes maybe even having to speak a tough word. We do that with love and with grace and with forgiveness in our hearts as we go. And we also speak kind words and faithful words and gracious words and healing words. All of that is part of what we are called to do. Not to participate in the systems that leave people out, but to trust that God's system gathers everybody in. And yes, that includes each of us. And it's in gathering each of us in that God sends us then out to gather in more so that God's grace can continue to multiply and be spread so that all people can know God's love. Sometimes that comes to us through a tough word, but that's right where Jesus meets us to set us free. Amen.